Many students ask, what is sweat soldering and how does it work? I'm Greenwood, and I'm going to show you how to sweat solder and show you some tricks to answer those questions. Welcome to my studio. Let's get started. Sweat soldering is a soldering technique that sandwiches solder between two pieces of metal. The metal is heated and the solder melts, soldering the two pieces together. The most common method is soldering a sheet on top of another sheet. You can also sweat solder wires together or a combination of sheet and wires. In this video, I'm going to show you the technique of sweat soldering two sheets together. In my next video, I'll show you the other combinations of sweat soldering wires and sheet silver. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss that or any other videos. When doing any kind of soldering, we always want to use the 5 secrets of perfect soldering. If you haven't seen my video, 5 secrets of perfect soldering every time, I'll have a link at the end of the video. Take a look at that. It'll really give you some helpful pointers on soldering. The first method of sweat soldering that we'll take a look at is sheet on sheet. I've cut out this sterling silver disc and then taken my jeweler saw and sawed out this fairly intricate pattern that we will sweat solder onto the disc. Our first secret for perfect soldering is to make sure that you have clean metal. I've taken both of these pieces. The disc I've already polished because I want a mirror finish on it, and I've taken it to the ultrasonic cleaner and got all the grease off of it. The cutout piece I'm going to lay on some emery paper onto the bench and rub it with some pressure, and this will clean off any of the oxides or any dirt, grease that's been on the back of the piece, and we'll make sure that it's good, clean, and ready to go. There's one part of soldering that I feel is overlooked too many times, and that's the cleanliness of the solder. We're all worried about making sure that the pieces of metal that we're soldering together are perfectly clean, which is a secret for soldering, but it's also important to have good, clean solder when we're soldering. Many jewelers will take their solder, especially in strip form or in sheet form, and then cut the pallions and then store them in a container for later use. So they'll have a whole nice supply to pull from. But I don't really agree with this philosophy. I want to make sure that the solder that I'm using is perfectly clean for the project. Because this is an alloy and it's a silver alloy, it will start oxidizing in the air as soon as you clean it off. It's a continual oxidizing process. I want to use the pallions that have as little oxide on them as possible because they're going to melt smoother and cleaner. What I like to do is to make sure that this is clean by taking some steel wool over the strip solder and pulling it down and cleaning any oxides off. You can even put it on your bench and rub it on both sides, and that will clean off the oxides. Now I normally cut off the amount of pallions that I'm going to need for the project, and let me show you how to do this. Here's my strip solder, and I like to take and cut a little fringe on the end of the strip. So we'll cut a little fringe with the shears. Take that one little fringe, pull it back on up so they're all going in one direction. And then cut across the fringe. Now if we just cut like this, they're going to fly all over the place. I like to use a small tray. This is an aluminum tray, and I simply take it and put my finger at the very end, and I've made sure that I've washed my hands too, so I don't have a lot of grease on my hands. And put your finger at the end of the strip, and then simply cut across with your shears. Now what happens is those pallions stay on your finger and they don't fly all over the studio. Then you can just drop them into the little tray that you have, and you have all your pallions ready to go for your project. Nice and clean. The second secret for perfect soldering is good fit. Want to make sure that both of these pieces fit perfectly flush against each other. The disc is nice and flat, but because I was doing some sawing on this piece, it's a little bit crooked. I want to flatten it down, and I can simply do that by putting it on the bench or a bench block or the anvil, anything that's nice and flat, and taking the rawhide mallet to it. I'm going to just tap it lightly, and this will smooth it all down and make it nice and flat without damaging the piece of sheet metal. Our next step and third secret of perfect soldering is flux coverage. We're going to cover the entire surface with borax flux and then melt off the excess. Before we do this, I want to point out that I've put a little X right here. I've scribed an X on the side of the sheet metal that I want the solder to be melted on. It's real disappointing once you get into a project and you have several pieces and all of a sudden you've discovered that you've put the solder on the wrong side, and now all of a sudden your design is backwards. So that's why I have a little X here to make sure that I keep my sides coordinated. Let's put on the flux. Just paint it over the entire surface. Put plenty on. Now I'm not concerned about getting the flux on the other side of the metal because I don't want the solder to flow there anyway. Now we've put the flux on the piece and we'll start melting off the excess flux. It bubbles and boils. That's the water that's in the borax flux, and then it will lay down flat and have that nice crystalline shiny look. Now the flux here is sticky, so it's easy to put the pallions on and have them stick in place, but the secret is to keep it warm. If you let it cool, then it crystallizes and then the solder does not stay on there very well. So I'm simply going to be warming the piece as I'm putting on the extra solder, and I like to drop the pallions in a little bit of flux to make sure that they help keep from oxidizing. So I'm just going to scatter them around the piece. I don't want to overdo it because that will fill in all the neat little parts that we've sawed. Okay, now we have the piece covered with the pallions of solder. I'm going to warm it slowly. Zoom in on the piece and the solder will melt. And there we go. Our next step is to sweat solder the two pieces together. And using our fifth secret of perfect soldering is even heat. My problem is if I heat from the top on a flat block, the top piece is going to get hotter much faster than the bottom disc. I want to heat those two pieces of metal up evenly. I have to solve that problem by using a tripod and a wire screen. I can put the piece of metal that we're sweat soldering on the screen, and I can come from underneath with the torch and heat up the disc first and put more heat on the disc and not have to worry about overheating or possibly even melting the top piece. I fluxed up our pieces and we have it on the tripod, and so I'm bringing the heat from underneath the piece. You'll see that it'll bubble and boil and burn off that excess flux. So we're putting more heat on the bottom disc. That will keep the two pieces evenly heated. Flux is boiling off, laying down flat. And once that disc gets hot enough to melt the solder will melt right onto it, and the two pieces will be sweat soldered together. Put a little pressure on it. Make sure you push down on it just a hair. And there's the solder starting to melt and flow. And flowing around the entire surface. Here's our piece fresh out of the pickle, and as you can see, it's got a perfect solder joint all the way around. That's good sharp edges here with good fillets of solder along the edge, and also no extra spillage or flowage out onto the disc. This is because we use just the right amount of solder. You don't need to overdo solder when you're sweat soldering. Many people throw too much solder on there and then it flows out onto your other piece. You don't need that. There's very little space, if any space, between the two pieces, so that solder will flow all the way over your piece and make a great solder joint. Also, there's no spaces in here too. That's because we used one of the secrets of soldering is a good fit right from the very start. So it laid down nice and flat, and we were able to just put slight pressure on it to make sure that it's seated perfectly. Sweat soldering. What a slick method of soldering. Try it. Take some simple shapes of scrap silver and practice your sweat soldering. The more you solder, the more comfortable you will become with this interesting technique. It really does make solder joints solder faster and cleaner, making our lives much happier. And speaking of happy, I want to thank you for your great comments, questions, and support of my YouTube channel. Keep your comments and questions coming. That's why I'm here, to help you grow your knowledge of this fascinating field of designer craftsman jewelry. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next video on sweat soldering wires and sheet. I'm Greg Greenwood. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.